It's because they're afraid of what they call the sentiment effect globally among the money lenders of the world of nationalisation. That's why. Now, we could dismiss that. I don't think we should dismiss that, because I think there are money lenders in the world, many of them, who don't wish to invest in a nationalised banking system, or in a country that has a nationalised banking system. So I don't believe there wouldn't be consequences. Equally, in their approach to the second element, the second priority they have is rectifying the public finances. And again, this is not just about sums, because you can rectify the public finances even within the narrow parameters of the EU plan, the Commission-approved plan, in various ways, around the balance between taxation and expenditure, or even in the context of expenditure, around where you spend the money. But the key thing here, from their perspective, and from the perspective of the centre-right, because the centre-right parties agree on this, is to rectify the public finances in a way that doesn't alienate potential investors, either domestically or those from abroad. And that translates into cutting public spending as it applies in terms of the public services themselves and the social services available to those who depend on them. Thus you have the discussion, which you addressed in your meeting the other evening, of cutting social welfare rates, etc., and so on. And the last element, which I always call the 2.5, because they haven't really got their heads around this as I would see it yet, except in the broadest terms. And the last one is improving competitiveness. Because if 40% of your trade is with countries whose currencies have in effect been significantly devalued, and if the domestic economy has collapsed and domestic consumption has collapsed, then you cannot avoid the issue of how do you address the route out. And they have placed all their eggs in the basket of piggybacking on a global recovery via world trade. And what does that translate into? It translates into the most narrow, market-oriented conception of competitiveness. It means driving down wages to simulate devaluation because we cannot devalue. And the interesting thing in the context of equality is that when you approach it in that way, you do something that devaluation doesn't do. Because actually, devaluation affects all sectors of society, not equally. But it does affect all sectors of society. Cutting wages and public services only affects working people in one way or the other. So that's the space they're in. Now, what way, I think we have to address the question in the context of developing a manifesto like this and promoting it, as to what way we would respond. Because we are not going to succeed in shifting the strategic space by one iota if we confine ourselves to populist campaigns against cuts, etc., so on and so forth. Because our population is, if not sufficiently well educated, certainly sufficiently well trained to ask the question, what's your alternative? And I use the word trained advisedly, because we've had a lot of training in our educational institutions over the last quarter of a century. Training in the practice and values of neoliberalism. So what way would we have responded? Well, we would have restricted the bank guarantee to the banks that are systemically important. We would have done bank nationalisations. We would have done it up front, not surreptitiously, as it's happening now, to try to conceal the fact from those who you can't conceal anything from, because they have so much access to information. But we would have done that. We would have done that in relation to the systemically, critically important banks. By the way, to reiterate again, we wouldn't have done it without consequences. There would be enormous consequences. Let there be no mistake about it, from those whose interests would not be served by such a decision. And on the public finances, I think a social democratic or left of centre government could do two things. They could stretch out the time frame a bit. They could probably adopt a more strident approach to the EU Commission. They could probably tell the EU Commission that we can't do it that way. We're not going to impoverish our population. We're not going to jeopardise the prospects for rebuilding our economy. And if you don't like it, we're going to have to try and get the money elsewhere. All in the hope that so much depends on a euro country not allowing its economy and public finances to collapse, that it would work. But let me say this to you. I think that to some extent our government engaged in that. Maybe not perhaps as courageously as some people in the left would, but I think they engaged in that to some considerable degree. And the other thing is that we would shift the balance. We would balance it differently, as between cuts and taxation, even notwithstanding the consequences, because that would have an implication for investment. But I'll address how we do that, how we'd address that in another way. But it's on the issue of competitiveness that the core difference between a social democratic left of centre administration and the current monopoly of the centre-right parties would differ. And it's the question that has been addressed here very succinctly and perceptively in this conference. It's in the context of the response to the question as to why more equal societies always do better. That's where the difference. It would be in the policy and competition that the fundamental difference would arise. Now, just to park that for a minute, and to say a word, if I may, about the trade union response. Because we tried to articulate the idea, not that we could make this go away, not that we could wave a wand and it would all disappear and we'd live in a socialist utopia. But we articulated the concept of the social dividend, that there would be a progressive, proactive, thought-out approach, such as that which has been presented here, that would recognise the reality that all of our incomes will fall, but that there would be a social dividend on the other end, that the proposition would be more sophisticated, more sustainable, more worthwhile, more egalitarian than the present proposition, which is that grin and bear it, and maybe in 2 or 3 years' time you might have a job. That's the current proposition. We advanced the idea of the social dividend. It'd be interesting to hear how many people here know about the proposition we advanced in those terms. People work very hard to ensure you don't know. Very hard. And perhaps we didn't work hard enough to ensure that you did. And we advanced, that crystallised into the Social Solidarity Pact and the 10-point plan, and the emphasis against the background of a strategy designed to cut pay, which basically isolated the people who work in the public service, 1/6 of the population, as public enemy number one, with a view ultimately, as was revealed in that economist conference in UCD in January, to driving down wages across the economy, thus simulating the devaluation. And it's very simple, really. You isolate people because they're 1/6 of the workforce. You convince everybody that they do nothing, that they're overpaid, that they're lazy, that they're so on and so forth. But most importantly, not so much about that. You convince the other 5/6 that they pay their wages, as they do, and that they're not getting a good return for their investment. And when you can turn the 5/6 of the population on the 1/6 and isolate them, so that when they march out of the hospital, the government is not blamed, the bankers are not blamed, the establishment is not blamed, the workers are blamed. Right? And when you demoralise them and break them, in the context of that kind of a fight that some ill-informed and inexperienced people in the trade union movement are anxious to walk into, then, because the public sector is the most unionised sector of the workforce, you can drive that agenda relentlessly across the private sector. That's the strategy. And that revealed itself at that economists' conference, revealed by an honest economist. He wasn't asked to speak again. Now,